When I begin to think about what Jesus can see, I'm pretty amazed. Think about this through some of the parts of the Bible. Jesus sees the past in John 1 and tells Nathanael, I saw you under a fig tree. Jesus sees the future when he prophesies in John 21 about Peter's death. Jesus sees into the heavenly realm and spiritual battle that goes on when sickness is being conquered and demons are being cast out in Luke chapter 10, when he said, I saw Satan falling like lightning as the disciples were doing what they were called to do. Jesus sees into the minds of people in Mark 2 when the religious leaders were thinking that he cannot forgive sins, and Jesus questions their thoughts and not their words. With all these amazing things that Jesus sees, would he ever be interested in something as simple as the scribble on a church tithing envelope? I think he is interested, and he does look at what we give in our generosity. Listen to this opening story in Luke 21 on our 260 journey. Starting in verse 1. And he looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury, and he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said, truly, I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. For they all out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on. We get worried too much about what the government can see and what they know about us that we forget something really, really important, that God is omniscient and he knows everything and sees everything that is going on in our lives, sees it all. Omniscience is a theological word to describe one of the attributes of God. It means that he is all-knowing, that he knows everything about me, not just what I do, but even why I do it. A few years ago, I was sitting in a meeting next to a very talented graphic designer for a major Christian organization. And he said this to me. He said, when we are designing something for an organization, we tell ourselves that really why people do certain things. He says there is a good reason and then there's the real reason. And our company always tries to figure out the real reason. I was reading a story about the American industrialist Henry Ford, who was once asked to donate money for the construction of a new medical facility in Ireland. The billionaire pledged to donate $5,000. The next day in the newspaper, the headlines read, Henry Ford contributes $50,000 to the local hospital. They added a zero purposely, maybe or maybe not. The irate Henry Ford was on the phone immediately to complain to the fundraiser that he had been misunderstood. The fundraiser replied that they would print a retraction in the paper. The following day it read, Henry Ford reduces his donation by $45,000 to the hospital. Realizing the poor publicity that this result, Henry Ford agreed to the $50,000 contribution. Was this the real reason? Or was he just simply saving face? Was it generosity or was he protecting his ego? See, Jesus always knows the real reason all the time. This is Jesus's last time in the temple before the crucifixion and his last message to the people. And his last message in the temple is on giving. Get this about the offering time. He's not just there, but he's watching. He knows not only who is giving, but what they gave. He saw the 2 small copper coins. And the offering that caught his attention was what I call, listen, a no-noise offering. Let me explain. Remember this, she put in that time what was called a lepta. It was less than a penny. It was the smallest currency in Palestine. Jesus has to be very close to see someone drop in something like that, those little 2 pennies. In fact, their nickname was called the thin ones. See, at that time, the bigger denominations of money were heavier. And the heavier the money, the heavier the cash, the louder it was when it hit the offering buckets. Why is loud important? It was so people could hear you making your offering, and your offering would make a sound, and people would clap and cheer for you the louder it was in the brass offering buckets. The treasury where they placed their offering consisted of 13 brass treasure chests called trumpets because they were shaped like inverted horns, narrow at the top and enlarged at the bottom. The richest coins on the brass trumpets caused oohs and ahs. But when a widow passed by and put in her thin ones, there was no noise from the trumpet buckets. The widow got no noise from the trumpets. Listen to this. But she did get noise from God that day. Jesus stood up and cheered for her offering. John Calvin got it right when he said there are 2 things happening here in this passage. There's a message for the poor and for the rich. To the poor, you can always give. Poverty can be greedy like anyone else. You don't need stuff to be greedy. This poor widow gave everything. I've watched just as much greed with little as I've watched it with people who had much. And then Calvin said, to the rich, Amount is not the issue, but sacrifice. God can do great things with tiny offerings, but a big sacrifice. Don't be deceived by amounts. They may deceive us, but they don't deceive Jesus. What you need to remember about giving, I think we learned from this story. First, only one person that day saw correctly what this woman gave, and that was the only one who mattered. Who knew that Jesus was going to be in the audience that day during the offering? Question: if you knew Jesus was going to be at church this coming Sunday, would our worship be any different? Would our giving be any different? Well, here it is. Revelation 2:1 says, he's always in his church walking amongst it. Also, what Jesus hears and sees is not what everyone else hears and sees. See, the people didn't hear anything that day, or if they did, the people heard copper. Jesus heard all. That's what he heard, all that she had. She didn't give copper coins, she gave it all. I wish we had the rest of this story, but we don't. We don't know in the Bible what happened to this woman, but I guarantee you there is a rest of the story. Why? I know God, and he always responds to this kind of giving. This is one of those stories that I got to find out the rest of when we get to heaven. What happened, Jesus, to that widow that had nothing now in her possession after she gave everything in that offering? Guaranteed she has a story to tell. God will always give you a story when you give it all to him. Thanks for joining the 260 Journey.